The year was 1912, and the Ozark Hills of southern Missouri carried with them an air of silence so thick it seemed to swallow even the boldest of sounds. The land stretched in ridges and hollows, darkened by forests of oak and hickory that rustled, with secrets older than the settlers who tried to tame them. Narrow dirt paths twisted through the trees, their edges softened by moss and fallen leaves, and small cabins clung stubbornly to patches of cleared land, surrounded by the wilderness that pressed in on every side. It was in this place, where superstition and isolation walked hand in hand, that the name of Eliza Whitlock would soon take root in whispers and fearful glances. But in the beginning, before her name was spoken in dread, the Whitlocks were little more than another family trying to carve out a life in the unforgiving terrain. The Whitlock homestead sat on a lonely ridge near a creek, its chimney leaning slightly, and its windows often dark after sundown. Farmers in the nearest town of Willow Creek knew of them, though few had reason to visit, and fewer still dared to linger near their property after dusk. The locals were not strangers to hardship. Harsh winters, failed crops, and illnesses that crept through valleys like fog were part of life in the Ozarks. Yet there was something about the Whitlock place that inspired unease. Hunters claimed that the woods near the ridge grew strangely silent, as if birds and animals alike avoided it. Children, daring one another, would run up the path only to return breathless, speaking of shadows that seemed to move on their own. Still, no proof of anything unusual ever surfaced, and the stories remained nothing more than campfire talk, until Eliza herself began to change. Eliza Whitlock was 20 when the townsfolk first noticed her. She was tall and pale, with long, black hair often tied back carelessly, and eyes that were said to be a shade too light, almost gray, giving her a look that some found unsettling. She seldom came into town except to buy flour, lamp oil, or cloth, and when she did, she moved quickly, avoiding unnecessary chatter. The shopkeeper, Mr. Farrow, once remarked that she had the air of someone always listening for something unseen. The remark was dismissed at the time, but it would later be recalled with a kind of grim significance. The truth was, Eliza had always felt the woods speaking to her. From childhood, she would wander further than her brothers dared, returning with strange trinkets, an animal skull polished by water, stones carved into peculiar shapes by the creek, feathers tied together with twine. Her mother scolded her, calling such things unholy, but her father would only shake his head and mutter that the land had its own language, and Eliza had been born knowing how to hear it. By 1912, Eliza had grown into a woman whose presence unsettled those who crossed her path. Farmers told of feeling watched when she passed their fields. Some swore that lanterns dimmed when she entered a room. Whether true or exaggerated, the stories built themselves quickly, and soon she was spoken of not as Eliza Whitlock, but simply that Whitlock girl. It was in the summer of that year that the shadows over the Ozarks seemed to thicken. The creek that wound past the Whitlock property turned dark, its waters fouled with a stench no one could name. Livestock belonging to neighbors were found, mutilated, their bodies arranged in patterns no wild beast would make. And on nights when the moon was hidden, strange cries echoed through the hollows, low, mournful wails that carried for miles. The people of Willow Creek looked to one another with pale faces, and though no one spoke the name aloud at first, their thoughts turned to Eliza. She herself was rarely seen during those nights. When she did appear, her clothes often bore stains. She would not explain. Her father claimed she was tending to sick animals in the woods, but the excuses satisfied no one. Rumors spread, gathering weight as they passed from mouth to ear, that Eliza spoke with the dead, that she had made bargains with things not of this world, that she had drawn her family into a darkness they could not escape. By late autumn, fear had hardened into suspicion. Farmers met at the church to discuss the Whitlock problem. Mothers forbade their children from going near the ridge, and still, the events grew stranger. A family traveling through the hills vanished without trace, their wagon found abandoned near the Whitlock path. At night, lights were seen flickering in the woods, blue flames that hovered and then disappeared. It was around this time that young Samuel Dwyer, a boy of 16, made the mistake of following those lights. His body was discovered 2 days later floating in the creek, his eyes wide open and his lips twisted as if frozen mid-scream. The coroner could not name a cause, but the townsfolk had already decided. They whispered Eliza's name with trembling lips, and though no accusation was made in public, her fate had already begun to unravel. The shadows over the Ozarks had deepened, and with them, so too had the terror. Eliza Whitlock's story was no longer the stuff of idle gossip. It was becoming a tale of dread, one that would soon consume the hearts and minds of all who lived in Willow Creek. The Whitlock homestead stood like a wound against the endless trees, its clappered walls weathered gray, the roof patched with tin that rattled whenever the wind swept through the ridge. From a distance, it looked like any other backwoods farmstead, a cabin with smoke trailing weakly from the chimney and a barn leaning like a drunkard beside it. But those who had dared to approach swore it felt different the closer you came. The silence around the ridge seemed thicker, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. Even the dogs that sometimes followed hunters up the trail would tuck their tails and whine, refusing to go any nearer. Eliza lived there with her parents, Thomas and Abigail, and her younger brother, Elias. Thomas Whitlock was a gaunt man, his beard streaked with gray, his back bent from years of cutting timber. He spoke little, though when he did there was a weight to his words that made men listen. Abigail, in contrast, had once been known in Willow Creek as a woman of warmth and laughter, but by 1912 her smile was a memory. Her eyes were sunken, her movements weary, as though some invisible burden pressed upon her shoulders. Elias, only 12, was seldom seen. When he was, he kept close to Eliza's side, his small hand gripping hers tightly, as though she were both his shield and his captor. Inside, the cabin smelled of smoke and herbs, a sharp mix that clung to clothing long after leaving. Strange bundles of dried plants hung from the rafters. Some were common, sage, willow bark, yarrow, but others no one recognized. The Whitlocks claimed they were remedies for illness, gathered by Eliza in her wanderings. To the townsfolk, though, they looked more like charms, talismans meant for warding off or inviting in forces unseen. Neighbors who had ventured inside described the place in hushed tones. A rocking chair that seemed to move on its own when no one sat in it. Drawings scratched into the wooden floor, circles and symbols, some smeared away as if someone had tried and failed to erase them. And always, Eliza's pale eyes watching, unblinking, as though she were listening to words no one else could hear. It was said that at night the homestead came alive with sounds, faint chanting, though no one could make out the words, the scraping of chairs against floorboards when all within were accounted for in bed, lights flaring in the windows though no lamp burned. The Whitlocks themselves denied nothing and explained less. When questioned, Thomas would simply say that the land is restless, and we must live as it asks us to. It was a statement that chilled those who heard it, though none dared press him further. Despite, or perhaps because of, their strangeness, the Whitlocks seldom sought help from the town. They grew their own crops, raised chickens and goats, and lived largely apart from others. But when they did come down into Willow Creek, people noticed how different they seemed. Eliza, in particular, had a way of unnerving those around her. Once, in the general store, a baby began wailing the moment Eliza stepped through the door, and would not be soothed until she left. Another time, a horse bolted when she passed, nearly trampling its handler. The incidents only fed the stories that were spreading faster than wildfire through the hills. As fear of the family grew, so too did the distance the townsfolk placed between themselves and the Whitlocks. Men who once cut timber near the ridge now worked elsewhere. Women warned their children never to wander in that direction. The preacher, Reverend Hale, began weaving warnings into his sermons, speaking of the devil walking in familiar shapes, of temptation hiding behind the guise of kin and neighbor. Though he named no one, his meaning was plain. The Whitlocks were marked, whether by God's judgment or something darker, and the town had begun to see them as a danger. Yet Eliza herself seemed untouched by the fear that clung to her name. She moved through the woods with a quiet confidence, her pale face set against the shifting shadows. More than once, she was seen standing at the edge of the ridge at night, her arms outstretched as though welcoming something unseen. Elias would sometimes be with her, holding a lantern that flickered as though the flame itself trembled. From the valley below, the sight was enough to send shivers through even the bravest of men. The homestead became less a house and more a symbol, a place where fear and imagination twisted into one. The missing travelers, the mutilated livestock, the drowned boy in the creek, each horror found its way back to the Whitlock cabin in the minds of the people. And though no proof tied Eliza or her kin to these events, the connection hardened, like frost over the town's collective heart. But within those walls, a story was unfolding that no outsider yet knew. Abigail's health was failing. She coughed blood into rags she kept hidden, her skin pale as linen. Thomas worked with a grim determination, often gone for days into the forest, returning with wood and game, but also with an exhaustion that aged him. And Elias clung to his sister, his eyes wide with a fear too old for a boy his age. Eliza, meanwhile, grew only more distant, her face a mask that betrayed nothing. At night she wandered the woods, and in the morning she returned with her hands stained and her clothes damp with dew, or perhaps with something else. The people of Willow Creek looked at the homestead and saw only a threat, but within its walls, the Whitlocks were bound by something far more complicated than superstition. Secrets lived there, buried beneath the timber and stone, secrets that would soon claw their way into the open. For the homestead was not merely a house, it was a gathering point, a place where the past and the present tangled in a web of fear and fate. And at the center of that web stood Eliza, silent, watchful, and waiting. The terror that gripped the Ozarks had a heartbeat, and it pulsed from the Whitlock home. The nights in the Ozarks were long and heavy, pressing against the cabins and farmsteads, like a weight no man could push back. When the sun dipped behind the ridges, the forests grew darker than pitch, the stars themselves often smothered by low clouds that clung to the hills. In those hours, when the wind stilled and the owls hushed, the people of Willow Creek spoke of whispers. They carried on the air, faint at first, like the rustle of leaves, but sharper the longer one listened. They seemed to come from the ridge where the Whitlock homestead stood. It began subtly. A trapper camping near the creek reported that he awoke in the dead of night to hear his own name called, soft and drawn out, as though spoken by a voice both near and impossibly far. When he leapt from his blanket, lantern in hand, the woods stood silent. Another man, walking home from town, swore he heard a woman's laughter weaving through the trees, though he walked alone. Soon nearly everyone in the valley had a story of their own. The mutter of phrases they could not understand, the creak of footsteps behind them that vanished when they turned, the sensation of being watched even in the solitude of their homes. Reverend Hale urged calm, insisting these were tricks of the imagination stirred by fear. But even his voice wavered when he confessed that he, too, had heard a knocking on his door one midnight, though no one was there when he opened it. More troubling still, his wife claimed she heard the same knocking, only from within their walls. By late autumn, the whispers had grown bold. Children awoke screaming, clutching their ears, babbling of voices that told them to come to the ridge. One boy, no older than 8, was found walking barefoot down the path toward the Whitlock land in the middle of the night, his eyes wide open but unseeing. His father caught him just before the boy reached the edge of the woods. When shaken awake, the child could remember nothing but the sound of Eliza Whitlock's voice calling him. The homestead itself seemed to breathe with these voices. Travelers spoke of passing by and hearing conversations within the cabin when all the windows were dark. Hunters said they heard chanting rise from the ridge and then fall silent, as though swallowed whole. None dared venture close enough to see who or what might be speaking. Inside the Whitlock home, life grew stranger still. Abigail's illness deepened, and her coughing fits often came with sudden shrieks, as though the pain within her ribs were not wholly of this world. Elias grew pale and withdrawn, speaking less with each passing day, his eyes darting to corners as though he saw shapes no one else could. And Eliza, always Eliza, wandered further into the night, her figure glimpsed. In the distance, her white dress catching what little moonlight there was as she moved through the trees. The whispers followed her. Elias once told his father that when Eliza left the cabin, the voices came to him too, whispering secrets in words he could not repeat. Thomas Whitlock struck him silent, forbidding him to ever speak of it again, but Elias did not need to. The look in his eyes told the truth. The voices were not only in the town, they had seeped into the Whitlock blood. Fear bound the people of Willow Creek tighter than any chain. Families barred their doors earlier each night, lanterns snuffed to keep from drawing attention. Yet the darkness brought no safety, for the whispers did not need light. They came through walls, through windows, through the very air, curling into ears like smoke. Some prayed louder, hoping to drown them out. Others drank themselves into stupors, preferring numbness to the crawling dread. It was then that the first real violence struck. A farmer named Joseph Brant, roused in the night by the sound of his name, followed the whispering voice into his field. At dawn, his wife found him near the scarecrow, his throat torn open, his eyes wide with terror. The ground around him was disturbed, as if many feet had danced there in the night, but not a single track could be traced. The sheriff tried to claim a wild animal had done it, though none could explain the absence of blood trails. Quietly, the town agreed upon another explanation. The Whitlocks had claimed him, and so the whispers became not merely a terror of the night, but a summons, a calling that seemed to grow stronger with each passing week. Those who resisted spoke of headaches so fierce they vomited, of shadows shifting in their homes, of dreams where Eliza Whitlock stood at the foot of their beds, her lips moving in silence while their bodies refused to wake. The preacher declared a fast, urging the town to gather in prayer to drive the evil out. But even within the church, the voices came. During one midnight service, as the congregation sang hymns, a chorus of unseen whispers rose beneath their song, weaving through their words like mocking echoes. Panic scattered them into the night, their prayers forgotten in the face of a darkness that no scripture seemed able to hold back. From that point forward, Willow Creek was no longer a town that merely feared the Whitlocks. It was a town besieged. Every whisper, every cry in the night, every shadow that stretched too long across the floor was tied to Eliza. Her name became both curse and warning, spoken in low tones, as if uttering it too loudly might invite her presence. And though no one dared confront the Whitlocks directly, the town's anger and fear burned hotter with every passing day, until it seemed inevitable that something would break. For in the Ozarks, where silence had once been a balm, the night now throbbed with voices, and always at the heart of them was the faintest sound of a woman laughing, soft, distant, and unending. By the winter of 1912, Willow Creek was a town suffocating under its own dread. The mountains and forests had always carried dangers: wolves, sudden storms, fever that could sweep through a valley and leave graves in its wake. But those were dangers the people understood. What had descended upon them now was different. It was unseen, unpredictable, and it gnawed at the mind more than the body. The Whitlocks had become the dark center of it all, a name spoken in shivers and silence, as if acknowledging them too boldly might draw the horror closer. Daily life faltered. Farmers neglected their fields, leaving crops to rot in the cold earth rather than venture near the ridge where the Whitlocks lived. Children were kept indoors, no longer free to run wild through the hollows. Men who once hunted the hills to provide meat for the winter abandoned their traps, unwilling to walk paths that curved too close to the Whitlock property. Even the town square, once a lively gathering place on Sundays, grew sparse. The church bells rang, but fewer came each week, as though worship itself could no longer shield them. Fear turned neighbor against neighbor. Suspicion blossomed like mold in the damp air, each family convinced the others were hiding some secret connection to the Whitlocks. When livestock went missing, accusations flew. When someone fell ill, whispers followed them, suggesting they had been marked. Friendships that had stood for decades splintered beneath the weight of paranoia. In hushed conversations, it was said the town itself was cursed, and that leaving might be the only way to survive. But few could leave. The land was all they had, and winter made travel treacherous. Reverend Hale tried to hold the community together, He organized vigils, fasting, and long nights of prayer, urging his flock to stay strong, to resist giving in to fear. Yet even he seemed worn thin. His sermons grew harsher, his eyes sunken, his voice breaking when he spoke of the devil's hand reaching into their lives. Those who knew him best noticed how his hands trembled as he lit the candles, how he flinched at sudden noises, as though haunted like the rest. Then came the dreams. One by one, townsfolk began speaking of visions that plagued their sleep. They all shared a thread: Eliza Whitlock. In some dreams, she stood at the foot of the bed, her pale eyes fixed on them as her lips moved silently. In others, she appeared in the woods, beckoning with one hand while shadows swirled at her feet. Some woke screaming, convinced they had heard her voice inside their heads. A few swore they had spoken with her in these dreams, though when pressed, they refused to repeat what she had said. The silence of those dreamers unsettled the town more than their words ever could have. By Christmas, the whispers in the night had become constant. No home was spared. Families huddled together in their cabins, clutching one another as the voices slid through the cracks of their walls. They came in tones both familiar and strange, sometimes sounding like a loved one, sometimes like something else entirely. The effect was maddening. One woman, hearing what she thought was her dead child calling her name, wandered into the snow without shoes. She was found frozen at the edge of the woods, her face turned toward the ridge. The sheriff, Henry Lawson, was a practical man who had long resisted superstition. But even he began to falter. His deputies deserted, unwilling to patrol the outskirts where the voices were strongest. His attempts to calm the people failed, for he had no answers, no protection to offer. More than once, he was seen sitting outside his office at night, lantern in hand, staring into the darkness as though waiting for something to step out of it. Some claimed they heard him muttering Eliza's name, not with anger, but with fear. The tension reached its peak when another body was found. Martha Green, a school teacher, had disappeared on her way home. 2 days later, hunters discovered her by the creek. Her face was pale, her body arranged carefully upon the stones, as though laid out by unseen hands. Her eyes were open, her mouth twisted into a silent scream. Around her were patterns drawn in the mud, circles interlocked with jagged lines, symbols no one recognized. The hunters fled, and when word spread through the town, it was as though a dam had broken. The people gathered at the church, demanding action. They shouted over one another, calling the Whitlocks murderers, witches, servants of the devil. Some cried for the sheriff to arrest them, others for the preacher to condemn them outright. A few called for fire, to burn the homestead to the ground and rid the land of its blight. Through it all, Reverend Hale tried to speak of caution, of God's justice rather than man's, but his words were drowned in the storm of anger. Outside, the night pressed against the church walls, the whispers hissing louder than the storm of voices within. Some swore they heard laughter weaving through the cracks of the old wooden building, mocking their desperation. Mothers clutched their children tighter, men gripped their rifles, and all knew that the fragile line between fear and fury was thinning. The town of Willow Creek was no longer simply afraid, it was consumed. And in that fever of dread, every glance turned toward the ridge, toward the homestead, toward Eliza Whitlock. Something had to be done, the people said. Something would be done. The new year of 1913 dawned cold and brittle, the ground locked in, frost, the sky low and heavy. For Willow Creek, the change of calendar brought no relief. If anything, the whispers pressed harder, the air itself carrying a tension that made every sound, every creak of timber, every crackle of firewood, feel like a warning. And with Martha Green's death still raw in their minds, the people demanded more than prayers. They demanded truth, and they demanded it fast. Sheriff Lawson was the first to make a move. Though fear clung to him like smoke, he knew he could not sit idle while the town clamored for justice. Gathering a small group of men, farmers, trappers, and 2 reluctant deputies, he resolved to visit the Whitlock homestead to see for himself whether the family was guilty of the horrors whispered about them. It was not an easy decision. Men argued against it, warning that stepping onto the Whitlock Ridge was as good as inviting death. Others, braver or perhaps more desperate, offered to join. In the end, 8 men rode out one gray morning, their rifles slung across their backs, their faces grim. The path to the ridge was silent, save for the crunch of hooves in the frost and the hiss of breath in the cold. The closer they came, the more uneasy the horses grew, ears flicking, nostrils flaring. When the men dismounted, the animals refused to go further, stamping and pulling at their reins as though something ahead repelled them. The men tethered them to trees and continued on foot, rifles in hand. The homestead appeared through the trees like a figure waiting in ambush. Smoke curled thinly from the chimney, though no sound came from within. The windows were dark, reflecting nothing but the gray sky. Sheriff Lawson called out, his voice steady but hollow in the stillness. No answer came. The men exchanged uneasy looks before approaching the door. It opened before they could knock. Eliza Whitlock stood there, her pale eyes fixed on them, her black hair loose around her shoulders. She did not speak, nor did she seem surprised to see them. She only stepped back, gesturing faintly for them to enter. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of herbs and smoke. Abigail lay on a bed in the corner, her breath ragged, her skin so thin it seemed to cling to her bones. Thomas sat beside her, his expression hollow, his eyes fixed on the fire. Elias stood near his sister, clutching her hand tightly. The sight was more pitiful than sinister, and for a moment the men faltered, as though the fear that had driven them there had been nothing more than illusion. But then they saw the symbols, carved into the beams above the hearth, drawn in soot along the floor, etched faintly into the wood of the walls. Circles within circles, jagged lines, runes that no man recognized. The sight of them made the farmers mutter curses under their breath, and one crossed himself. Sheriff Lawson demanded an explanation. Thomas Whitlock said nothing. Abigail coughed, whispering words no one could make out. And Eliza, her face unreadable, spoke only this: "The land is restless. We do what we must to keep it still." The men pressed her for more, but she offered nothing. When one of the farmers accused her of Martha Green's death, her eyes flicked to him with such intensity that he stumbled back, rifle shaking in his hands. Elias whimpered, and Thomas rose to stand between his daughter and the men, his voice low and sharp. "Leave this place. You do not understand." The confrontation might have ended there, in silence and stalemate, but one of the deputies spotted something by the doorframe, a bundle of feathers, bones, and string tied together and hung like a charm. He tore it down, holding it up with a shout. Panic rippled through the group, anger close behind it. They accused the Whitlocks of witchcraft, of summoning the very voices that tormented the town. The sheriff, though shaken, held his men back. He ordered them to leave the house untouched, to return to town and deliberate. Reluctantly, they obeyed, though their glares lingered on Eliza as if they could burn holes through her skin. As the men left, Elias clung tighter to his sister, whispering something into her ear that no one else could hear. Eliza's lips curved in what might have been a smile, or a grimace. Back in Willow Creek, the sheriff's report divided the town. Some argued that the Whitlocks were guilty, their strange markings and charms proof enough. Others hesitated, troubled by the sickness and sorrow they had seen in the family. But the majority had already made up their minds. Guilt or innocence no longer mattered. The Whitlocks were a curse, and curses had to be purged. In the days that followed, small groups began forming, whispering of vigilante justice. Men polished their rifles, women filled jars with kerosene, and talk of fire spread like sparks in dry grass. The preacher tried to intervene, pleading for patience, for God's hand to guide them rather than their own fury, but his voice was thin against the roar of fear. Meanwhile, the whispers in the night grew louder, more insistent. Some said they heard chanting, others laughter. A few claimed to see lights drifting down from the ridge, blue and flickering like ghostly lanterns. And then more deaths followed, livestock slaughtered, another hunter gone missing, and a child sickened beyond the doctor's skill. Each tragedy tied itself to the Whitlocks in the minds of the people. Whether truth or coincidence, the search For truth had begun with the sheriff's ride to the homestead. But what truth had been found was more unsettling than the lies. For now the town knew the Whitlocks were different, yes, but they did not know how, or why, or what Eliza's place was in it all. And in the vacuum of not knowing, fear filled every corner, shaping its own answers. Willow Creek was no longer asking questions. It was preparing for judgment. And the ridge, silent and waiting, seemed to lean closer with every passing night, as though listening for the moment the first torch would be lit. The night they came for the Whitlocks was colder than any before. The kind of cold that burns the lungs and stiffens the fingers even through thick gloves. Snow had fallen in the afternoon, a thin white crust now crunching beneath boots as the men of Willow Creek gathered at the edge of town. They carried rifles slung over their shoulders, axes strapped to belts, and jugs of kerosene in their hands. Some trembled from fear, others from anticipation, but all carried the same grim resolve. The time for whispers had ended. It was time for fire. Sheriff Lawson was there, though his face was drawn and pale. He had fought against this course of action, but the tide of fury was too strong. Even Reverend Hale, once a voice of restraint, had fallen silent. In the days leading to this night, his sermons had grown darker, more desperate. He spoke of purging evil, of casting out corruption before it consumed them all. His flock had listened, and now they marched with torches in hand. The climb to the ridge was a grim procession. The forest loomed on either side, the trees black against the snow. Torches cast flickering shadows that danced like phantoms along the path. Some swore they heard voices urging them forward, laughter weaving among the branches. Others muttered prayers, clutching crucifixes as though wood and iron could shield them from what lay ahead. The Whitlock homestead appeared at last, its windows glowing faintly with lamplight, its chimneys spilling a weak trail of smoke. It looked almost ordinary, a lonely house in the wilderness, but the men knew better. Their fear twisted it into something monstrous, a den of shadows where curses were woven and horrors birthed. The first stone shattered a window. Glass rained into the cabin, and a child's scream rose from within, Elias's voice thin and terrified. Torches lifted, rifles cocked, and the men surged forward. Eliza appeared in the doorway. She did not scream or plead. She stood tall, her pale eyes gleaming in the torchlight, her face calm as if she had been expecting them all along. For a moment, the mob faltered, their rage dimming under the weight of her gaze. But then Thomas Whitlock stepped beside her, his voice booming against the night. "You fools, you do not understand what you're doing." The men shouted him down, their cries of witch and devil's spawn rolling like thunder. Sheriff Lawson raised his hand for order, but the crowd surged past him. Kerosene was thrown against the walls, flames licking where torches touched. The cabin shuddered with the crackle of fire, smoke curling into the winter air. Inside, Abigail coughed violently, her frail body racked with spasms as Elias tried to shield her. Thomas fought to smother the flames, but the fire spread faster than he could contain. And through it all, Eliza stood unmoving, her eyes fixed on the mob outside. Some swore later that she smiled as the fire roared, though none could agree whether it was defiance, madness, or something far worse. Then the whispers began. They rose from the trees, from the snow, from the very air itself. Thousands of voices, shrieking, chanting, laughing. The mob froze, torches wavering, rifles shaking. The voices grew louder, circling them, echoing from every direction. Men clutched their heads, some dropping to their knees. One fired his rifle blindly into the darkness, the shot vanishing into the night without echo. The ground trembled beneath them. The snow shifted as though something moved beneath it, great unseen shapes twisting and coiling. Torches flickered, then snuffed out, plunging half the mob into darkness. Panic erupted. Some men fled, stumbling through the trees, their screams trailing behind them. Others pressed forward, desperate to finish what they had started, as though fire alone could silence the voices. Inside the cabin, Eliza finally moved. She turned to her brother, placing a hand on his cheek, whispering words he would later repeat only in his sleep. Then she stepped out into the night, the fire blazing. Behind her, her figure silhouetted against the flames. The mob recoiled. Even Sheriff Lawson stepped back, his rifle slipping from his hands. Eliza's pale eyes scanned them one by one, her lips moving soundlessly. And then the whispers stopped. The silence was so sudden it rang in their ears. For a heartbeat, the world held still. Then the fire roared higher, engulfing the cabin in a wall of flame. Thomas's voice bellowed from within, shouting Eliza's name, followed by Elias's terrified cries. The roof groaned, timbers cracking. And Eliza did not turn back. She walked forward, through the snow, past the mob that parted before her like reeds before the wind. None dared touch her, none dared speak. She passed through them in silence, her bare feet leaving no print in the snow, her figure fading into the blackness between the trees. The homestead collapsed behind her, sparks spiraling into the sky, the screams of Thomas and Abigail swallowed by the flames. When dawn came, only ash remained, the snow melted to mud around it. Of Eliza and Elias, there was no trace. The town told itself it had been victorious, that the evil was purged. They buried their dead, mended their roofs, and tried to return to life as it had been before. But the nights remained heavy. The whispers still came, faint but insistent, curling through the hills. And when children woke crying, saying a woman had stood at their window with pale eyes and a voice like smoke, their parents held them close but dared not look outside, for though the homestead was gone, the terror was not. The reckoning in the hills had come, but it had not ended. It had only changed shape. And somewhere in the endless woods of the Ozarks, Eliza Whitlock still walked. The ruins of the Whitlock homestead smoldered for days, a blackened scar on the ridge above Willow Creek. The fire had burned so fiercely that little remained but charred beams and twisted iron hinges, scattered like bones across the snow. The smell of smoke lingered in the valley long after the last ember died, clinging to the air as though the land itself refused to let go. Men from the town climbed the ridge to search the ashes, but they found no bodies, only fragments of Abigail's. Bed frame, the stone hearth cracked in two, and the faint outlines of symbols burned deeper into the floorboards than any fire could reach. At first, the people told themselves this was victory. They had faced the darkness, rooted it out, and destroyed it before it could consume them. Reverend Hale preached that God's hand had guided their fire, that the absence of bodies was proof the Whitlock souls had been carried off in judgment. Sheriff Lawson, though shaken, declared the matter closed. The town, he said, could begin to heal, but healing never came. In the weeks that followed, the whispers did not fade. If anything, they grew bolder, slipping into the ears of men at their plows, women at their spinning wheels, children at their lessons. At night, families still woke to the sound of their names spoken softly from the darkness. Hunters still found strange patterns in the snow, circles, spirals, shapes that vanished when touched but lingered in memory. And though Eliza Whitlock was gone, her presence remained. Children were the first to see her. They spoke of a pale figure at the edge of the woods, her hair dark, her eyes gray and shining. Some said she beckoned them, others that she stood silently watching until they screamed and fled. A boy who wandered too far after dusk claimed she had spoken to him, her voice like a song he could not forget. His parents forbade him from repeating the words, but at night he sang them in his sleep. The tune low and strange, adults too began to glimpse her. A farmer, out late tending his stock, saw her walking along the creek, her reflection rippling though the water remained still. A woman hanging laundry at dawn found her standing among the trees, watching with an expression that was neither kind nor cruel. Each time someone saw her, she vanished before they could approach, fading into the shadows like smoke on the wind. The fear that gripped Willow Creek deepened into something heavier, something closer to despair. The townsfolk had destroyed the homestead, yet the evil they feared had not left. It had dispersed, seeping into the hills, the trees, the very soil. The ridge became a place no one dared climb, a scar on the land that grew darker with each telling of the tale. Over the years, families left the valley. Some fled after livestock failed, others after children fell sick, others still after dreams of Eliza grew too frequent to bear. Cabins were abandoned, fields went untended, and the forest crept back, swallowing what had once been cleared. Willow Creek, once small but steady, dwindled into little more than a name on a map, yet the story remained. Travelers passing through the Ozarks were warned of the ridge and the woman who walked its shadows. Campfires carried the tale farther, each telling shaping it anew. Some said Eliza was a witch who had cursed the town. Others whispered she was a victim, burned unjustly, her restless spirit seeking vengeance. Still others swore she had never died at all, that she lived in the woods, unchanged by time, waiting for the day she would return. And there were those who claimed the truth was stranger still, that Eliza Whitlock had not been the cause of the whispers, but their vessel. That the land itself had chosen her, and through her it spoke, and when the people tried to destroy her, they had only set that voice free. In the end, it did not matter which version was believed. What mattered was the echo, the lingering fear that clung to the hills long after the Whitlocks were gone. On nights when the moon was hidden, when the wind stilled and the owls fell silent, the people swore they could hear her still. A woman's laugh, faint and distant, a whisper curling just behind the ear, a presence watching from the edge of the woods. Generations passed, and the story of Eliza Whitlock wove itself into the fabric of the Ozarks. Parents told it to children as warning. Travelers carried it down winding roads to other valleys and towns. The name became legend, then myth, yet always with the same chill at its core. For those who lived nearest the ridge knew one thing with certainty: legends may fade, but echoes never die. And in the coldest hours of the night, when the world seemed to hold its breath, those echoes spoke with a voice as clear as ever. Eliza's voice, calling, laughing, whispering still.